The woman pointing the police at me had no idea she was paying rent to the man she was trying to throw out. The first thing I noticed wasn't the flashing red and blue lights bouncing across the lake. It was the smell of rain-soaked cedar drifting off the porch my grandfather built with his own hands nearly 40 years ago. That scent never changed. It lingered in the cool mountain air every fall, mixing with fresh water, pine needles, and the faint smoke from cabins scattered around the shoreline. I'd driven almost 200 miles to spend a quiet weekend at my lakeside cabin, hoping for nothing more exciting than black coffee on the dock before sunrise. Instead, the crunch of gravel beneath my truck tires was swallowed by the sharp chirp of police radios. Before I even stepped out, a woman's voice cut through the stillness. "Officer, that's him. He's trespassing." I looked toward the neighboring property and immediately recognized Victoria Hayes standing beside a perfectly trimmed hedge, with one hand pointing directly at me while the other clutched her phone like she'd just solved the biggest crime in the county. Her white SUV sat behind her with the HOA logo magnet still attached to the door, as if neighborhood authority somehow extended to criminal law. Two deputies turned toward me with professional expressions that revealed nothing except curiosity. One rested a hand on his duty belt while the other glanced from me to the cabin, then back again. I quietly shut my truck door. The familiar metallic click echoed across the water. It was strangely calming. The old brass key still hung from the leather keychain my father gave me years earlier. I slipped it into my jacket pocket without saying a word. Victoria marched closer before either deputy spoke. "I've been telling him for months this cabin doesn't belong to him," she declared loudly enough for several neighbors gathering near the shoreline to hear. "He's been warned repeatedly. We have community rules. He's refused every one of them." Her confidence would have impressed me if it weren't so spectacularly misplaced. The taller deputy offered a polite nod. "Sir, we're responding to a report that someone is unlawfully occupying this property. Would you mind telling us your name?" "Ethan Carter," I answered evenly. The name seemed to mean nothing to Victoria. In fact, hearing it appeared to make her even bolder. She folded her arms and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone convinced the ending had already been written. Around us, more people drifted onto their decks, pretending to adjust patio furniture while openly watching the scene unfold. Cell phones appeared. Someone whispered. Somewhere across the lake a boat engine hummed before fading into the distance. Everything else felt suspended, like the entire shoreline had paused to witness what Victoria clearly expected to become another HOA victory. She stepped closer to the deputies. "He's making everyone uncomfortable," she insisted. "This community has standards." I looked past her toward the cabin windows reflecting the afternoon light. Every board, every stone, every weathered beam carried memories far older than the Homeowners Association she proudly represented. I had learned long ago that arguing with certainty rarely changed minds. Evidence did. So I simply nodded when the deputy asked for identification. As I reached slowly for my wallet, my fingers brushed the old brass key again. It felt smooth from decades of use. The same key that had opened this front door since before Victoria Hayes had ever heard of this lake. She mistook my silence for surrender. I knew better. Sometimes the loudest person in the room is only announcing how little they actually know. While one of the deputies checked my driver's license, my eyes wandered past the porch swing, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. That swing had carried 3 generations of my family long before anyone dreamed of forming a homeowners association around this lake. My grandfather, Walter Carter, bought the property in 1983 after returning from 30 years as a public school principal. Back then there were only a handful of cabins scattered around the shoreline, connected by gravel roads, old fishing docks, and neighbors who borrowed tools instead of filing complaints. Every summer of my childhood smelled exactly like this afternoon: fresh pine, damp cedar, sunscreen, charcoal grills, and lake water warming beneath the July sun. My father taught me how to repair the dock one weathered board at a time. My mother planted the wildflowers that still bloomed beside the stone walkway every spring. Every scratch on the porch railing had a story attached to it. Every loose floorboard squeaked with familiar rhythm. After both of my parents passed away within 3 years of each other, I could not bring myself to sell the cabin. Instead, I spent nearly 2 years restoring every inch of it myself. I replaced the roof after a harsh winter storm, rebuilt the fireplace using the original fieldstone, refinished every cedar beam, and installed new plumbing without changing the character of the place. I wanted the cabin to feel exactly as my grandfather had imagined it, only stronger and ready for another generation. The property became more than a vacation home. It became the one place where life always slowed down enough for me to hear my own thoughts. My work eventually led me into real estate investment, not the flashy kind people brag about online, but quiet properties in small lake communities that most investors ignored. I believe that well-maintained homes created stable neighborhoods, and over the years I purchased several cabins through limited liability companies managed by a professional property management firm. I rarely introduced myself as the owner because I preferred letting the management company handle leases, maintenance requests, inspections, and paperwork. It kept business separate from my weekends and allowed tenants to feel comfortable without a landlord constantly appearing around the corner. That system had worked flawlessly for years. The only thing I insisted on personally was visiting this cabin several times every season. It reminded me where everything had started. As the deputy handed back my license, Victoria continued speaking with absolute confidence about community standards and unauthorized occupants. Listening to her, I almost smiled. She knew nearly every mailbox on the lake, every paint color approved by the architectural committee, every landscaping rule written into the neighborhood handbook. Yet she had never bothered to learn who actually owned many of the properties surrounding her. She assumed appearances told the whole story. An older gentleman standing near the boat ramp glanced toward me with a puzzled expression, as though trying to remember where he had seen me before. He had probably waved to me from his fishing boat dozens of times over the years. The lake remembered people better than the association ever did. The breeze carried the gentle sound of water brushing against the dock pilings, and somewhere behind the cabin a wind chime rang softly beneath the tall pines. Those familiar sounds settled my nerves more effectively than any argument ever could. I had learned through years of contracts, closings, and negotiations that patience often revealed far more than confrontation. Sometimes the truth simply needed enough silence to introduce itself. If there was one thing everyone around Silver Pine Lake seemed to agree on, it was that nothing happened without Victoria Hayes knowing about it first. She had lived there for barely 6 years. Yet she carried herself as though her signature had built every dock, planted every pine tree, and written every deed in the county. Before becoming president of the Homeowners Association, she had worked as a successful real estate agent, and she never really separated those two identities. Every conversation somehow turned into property values, neighborhood image, resale potential, or community standards. She drove slowly through the winding roads almost every morning in her spotless white sport utility vehicle, windows down, sunglasses perfectly positioned, making notes on a clipboard that rarely left her passenger seat. Some people joked that she could spot an unapproved flower pot from half a mile away. Others laughed quietly when she was not around, but very few challenged her openly. Over time, she had become so accustomed to people giving in that she stopped asking and simply started announcing decisions as though they had already been approved. It began with little things. She convinced residents to replace weathered wooden signs with polished stone monuments because they looked more upscale. Then came restrictions on boat covers, dock furniture, mailbox colors, outdoor lighting, and even the type of chairs people could leave on their porches during the winter. Most owners eventually complied because arguing consumed more time than repainting a mailbox or moving a flower bed. Victoria interpreted every compromise as proof that her authority had no practical limit. She especially disliked owners who were rarely seen around the lake. Vacation homes frustrated her because they could not attend monthly meetings or defend themselves against rumors. Whenever someone visited only a few weekends each year, she treated the property as though it had slipped into a gray area where Homeowners Association preferences mattered more than actual ownership. My cabin had slowly become one of her favorite targets. According to letters forwarded by my management company over the previous year, she had questioned everything from the natural finish on my cedar siding to the length of my dock, despite both fully complying with county regulations. She objected to the antique brass house numbers because they did not match newer neighborhood designs. She disliked the old canoe hanging beneath the porch because she considered it outdated. She even suggested replacing the hand-carved wooden welcome sign my grandfather made with a standardized Homeowners Association approved plaque. Every recommendation carried the same polished tone, as though she were offering friendly advice instead of steadily testing how far she could extend her influence. My property manager usually handled those notices with brief professional responses, attaching permits, inspection reports, and copies of recorded covenants whenever necessary. I never responded personally because there was no reason to. Business remained business, and weekends remained family time. Apparently, that silence convinced Victoria that the unseen owner behind the paperwork was either indifferent or easy to intimidate. Standing beside the deputies now, she spoke with complete confidence because the story in her mind had already reached its ending. She believed she had finally cornered an anonymous rule breaker who would either apologize or disappear. She never imagined that every assumption she had built over the past year rested on one missing piece of information, and that missing piece was standing only a few feet away with an old brass key resting quietly inside his jacket pocket. The deputies remained calm, but the atmosphere around the cabin kept growing heavier as more neighbors wandered toward the shoreline under the convenient excuse of evening walks. Nobody wanted to miss what they believed would become the latest Homeowners Association victory. I could hear hushed conversations blending with the gentle splash of waves against the dock. Somewhere nearby, the smell of someone grilling burgers drifted across the water, mixing with fresh-cut grass and the faint scent of gasoline from a pontoon boat easing into its slip. It would have been an almost perfect summer evening if not for the accusation hanging in the air. Victoria seemed to thrive on having an audience. She reached into a leather folder and confidently handed several papers to one of the deputies. "These are our violation notices," she announced. "He has ignored repeated warnings." The board voted that unauthorized occupancy could not continue. The deputy carefully scanned the documents before looking back at me. "Sir, do you have anything that shows you have permission to be here?" I met his eyes and answered politely. "I do, but I would like to understand exactly what I am being accused of first." Victoria laughed softly, shaking her head as though she had already heard every excuse imaginable. "You see, that is exactly how people stall. He never answers simple questions." She pointed toward the cabin. "He changes things whenever he visits. He refuses to follow architectural guidelines. He does not attend meetings. Nobody even knows who he really is." I almost found that last sentence amusing. She was absolutely right about one thing. Nobody there knew who I really was. Over the previous year, she had slowly transformed ordinary disagreements into official complaints. First came letters demanding that I remove the vintage canoe hanging beneath the porch because it supposedly looked abandoned. Then she claimed my dock furniture violated newly proposed aesthetic standards that had never actually been adopted. A month later, she insisted the cedar stain on the cabin exterior was the wrong shade, despite matching photographs taken decades before the Homeowners Association even existed. Every response from my property management company included permits, inspection reports, and copies of recorded documents. Every answer was factual, respectful, and complete. None of it satisfied her because the paperwork never gave her what she really wanted: control. When written notices accomplished nothing, she escalated. Temporary signs suddenly appeared near the entrance road reminding visitors that Homeowners Association approval was required for extended stays. Contractors working nearby quietly mentioned that Victoria often stopped them to ask questions about cabins that were not hers. A landscaping company once called my management office after she instructed them not to trim my lakeside path because she claimed the association would soon assume responsibility for that section of shoreline. Fortunately, they refused without written authorization. Looking back, every incident seemed minor by itself. Together, they painted a very different picture. This afternoon was simply the latest step in a pattern that had been growing for months. The deputy folded the documents and handed them back to Victoria. "These notices explain Homeowners Association concerns," he said evenly, "but they do not establish ownership." For the first time, her confident smile flickered almost imperceptibly before returning. "Ownership is not the issue," she replied quickly. "Community safety is. He should not be here until everything is verified." I quietly slipped my wallet back into my pocket beside the old brass key. The cool metal rested against my fingertips like a familiar reminder that patience always outlasted assumptions. Victoria believed the deputies were helping her finish a story. In reality, they had only begun asking the questions that would eventually unravel every conclusion she had already reached. The taller deputy took a slow breath before speaking again. Mr. Carter, nobody is asking you to leave at this moment. We are simply trying to determine who has the legal right to occupy the property. His measured tone contrasted sharply with Victoria's growing impatience. She shifted her weight, crossed her arms again, and glanced toward the small crowd gathering near the shoreline as though expecting someone to applaud. Instead, people simply watched in silence. I had spent enough years negotiating contracts to recognize the moment when emotions began replacing facts. That was usually when the other side made mistakes. I had no intention of interrupting that process. "Officer," I said calmly, "would you mind asking Mrs. Hayes a few questions before I answer any more of hers?" The deputy nodded. "Fair enough. Mrs. Hayes, how do you know this gentleman does not belong here?" Victoria answered immediately, almost too quickly. "Because I know every homeowner in this community." "Personally?" the deputy asked. "Absolutely," she replied without hesitation. "Then you know who owns this cabin?" She smiled confidently. "The owner lives out of state. We have never seen him. Everything goes through some management office. Whoever this man is, he certainly is not the owner." I remained completely still while she continued building her own argument. "Has the owner ever told you that this gentleman is not allowed on the property?" the deputy continued. Victoria paused for the briefest moment before recovering. "No, but that is obvious. We have documented violations for over a year." The deputy looked down at his notepad. "Violations are different from ownership." She quickly redirected the conversation. "He refuses to cooperate with the association. That alone should tell you everything." I quietly reached into the truck and pulled out an old canvas bag containing groceries for the weekend. Fresh bread, locally roasted coffee, and a small tackle box rested inside. Ordinary things. Familiar things. The smell of coffee beans escaped as I zipped the bag closed again. It reminded me why I had driven all this way in the first place. Peace. The younger deputy noticed the brass key resting against the bag's handle. "That looks like an older key." I smiled politely. "It has opened the same front door for decades." Victoria immediately cut in. "Anyone can copy a key." I simply nodded. "That is true." She seemed almost disappointed that I refused to argue. Every calm answer appeared to frustrate her a little more. She wanted confrontation because confrontation made her feel in control. Silence gave her nothing to push against. The deputies continued asking simple questions while I answered each one directly without volunteering anything extra. My full name, my driver's license, the reason for my visit, how often I stayed at the cabin. Meanwhile, Victoria spoke over nearly every response, adding opinions where facts were requested and assumptions where evidence was expected. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Even several neighbors who had quietly gathered near the dock began exchanging uncertain looks. The older gentleman by the boat ramp slowly removed his baseball cap and studied me more carefully, as though an old memory was finally beginning to surface. The evening breeze rippled across the lake, carrying the soft tapping of loose sailboat lines against aluminum masts. The familiar sound settled over the shoreline while the conversation grew strangely lopsided. I had answered every question with patience. Victoria had answered every question with certainty. Only one of those approaches could survive once real records entered the conversation, and I knew exactly which one it would be. The taller deputy finally reached for the microphone clipped to his shoulder and quietly asked dispatch to verify the recorded owner of the property. His voice remained calm, almost casual, but I noticed Victoria stiffen ever so slightly. Confidence has a different sound when someone else starts checking facts. The lake had grown almost perfectly still. Even the children who had been laughing farther down the shoreline seemed to have wandered home for dinner, leaving only the distant call of a loon and the gentle creak of wooden docks settling against the water. The smell of cedar mixed with cool evening air as the first shadows stretched across the porch my grandfather had built. I stood there with my canvas bag resting beside my boots, saying nothing. Years of negotiating commercial leases had taught me one simple lesson. The first person who feels compelled to fill every silence usually reveals more than intended. Victoria could not help herself. "I already explained everything," she insisted, looking from one deputy to the other. "The actual owner lives somewhere else. We deal with a management company. Whoever this man is, he cannot simply appear whenever he wants." The younger deputy glanced up from his notepad. How do you know the owner does not authorize his visits? She hesitated just long enough for the question to land. Because no owner would ignore association rules for this long. It was not an answer. It was an assumption dressed like one. A soft vibration came from my phone. I looked down without unlocking it. The screen displayed a familiar name. Madison Brooks, the senior property manager who handled every lease across my lake properties. She had probably received a call from the deputies after dispatch contacted the management office listed in county records. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without responding. There was no need to rush. The process was unfolding exactly as it should. A minute later, the taller deputy's radio crackled. He listened carefully without interrupting, then asked for the spelling of a business name before repeating it aloud. Carter Legacy Holdings, Limited Liability Company. Hearing my family name spoken over the radio caused the older gentleman near the boat ramp to lift his head immediately. His eyes narrowed as recognition finally settled across his face. I remembered him then. Frank Dawson. He had fished these waters with my father decades ago. Before he could say anything, another message came through the deputy's radio. The recorded ownership had been confirmed. The property management company had also confirmed that an authorized representative of the ownership group was currently on site. The deputy slowly looked toward me. "Mr. Carter," he asked politely, "would you happen to be connected with Carter Legacy Holdings?" I answered with the same calm voice I had used all afternoon. "Yes, deputy. I founded the company after inheriting my family's properties." Victoria immediately shook her head. "That proves nothing. Lots of people claim things." I simply reached into my jacket and removed a slim leather card holder that had remained untouched throughout the entire conversation. Inside was a business identification card, a company credential, and a notarized authorization letter that I routinely carried whenever visiting investment properties. I handed them to the deputy without a single extra word. The evening breeze lifted the corner of one document as he began reading it, and for the very first time since I had driven onto the gravel driveway, Victoria Hayes stopped talking completely. The deputy studied each page with the kind of careful attention that comes from knowing paperwork usually tells a more reliable story than raised voices. He compared the identification card with my driver's license, then with the authorization letter bearing the company seal. Without saying anything, he handed the documents to his partner, who read them just as carefully. Neither man looked impressed. Neither looked skeptical. They simply read. That quiet professionalism changed the entire atmosphere. Victoria took a hesitant step forward. "There has to be some mistake," she said, her confident tone noticeably softer than before. "Those papers only show he works for the company." Before I could answer, my phone rang again. This time I accepted the call and placed it on speaker after asking the deputy if he minded. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," Madison Brooks said in her familiar, steady voice. "Dispatch contacted our emergency line. We have confirmed that you are the managing member of Carter Legacy Holdings and the direct owner representative for every property listed under the Silver Pine portfolio." The deputy thanked her and asked one additional question. "Can you also confirm who leases the residence occupied by Mrs. Victoria Hayes?" I watched Victoria's expression freeze. The lake seemed unusually quiet while everyone waited for the answer. Papers rustled gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere across the water, a screen door closed with a hollow wooden thump. Madison did not hesitate. "Certainly. Mrs. Hayes resides at 42 Pine Ridge Lane under a residential lease administered by our office." The deputy looked at me briefly before continuing. "And who is the landlord listed on that lease?" "The landlord is Carter Legacy Holdings, represented by Mr. Ethan Carter." Nobody spoke. Even the wind chime behind the cabin fell still for a moment. Frank Dawson slowly removed his glasses and let out a long breath that sounded almost like a quiet laugh of disbelief. Victoria stared at me as though she had never actually seen my face before. That cannot be right," she whispered. Madison continued calmly. "Mrs. Hayes has occupied the property for approximately 4 years. Rent payments are processed electronically through our management office. Mr. Carter does not personally collect rent because all tenant communication is handled by our staff unless ownership issues require his involvement." The younger deputy lowered the phone slightly and turned toward Victoria. "Ma'am, based on the information we have received, Mr. Carter appears to be lawfully present on property owned by his company." She opened her mouth as if searching for another argument, but none came. Every assumption she had repeated throughout the afternoon dissolved beneath a few verified records and one straightforward phone call. I slipped the old brass key from my pocket and held it in my palm for a second before unlocking the front door. The lock turned with the same smooth click I had heard since childhood. The familiar scent of cedar floors and stone fireplace drifted out as the door slowly opened. I looked back at Victoria, not with satisfaction or anger, but with the quiet certainty that facts never needed dramatic entrances. They simply arrived when someone finally bothered to look for them. The deputies exchanged a brief glance before returning my documents. One of them offered a respectful nod. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Carter. I believe we have a much clearer understanding of the situation now." The deputies closed their notebooks, and the entire mood along the shoreline shifted so quietly that it almost felt like watching the wind change direction across the lake. A few minutes earlier, everyone had been staring at me as though I were an unwelcome stranger. Now those same neighbors were looking toward Victoria, waiting to see what she would say next. She never found the words. Her shoulders lowered ever so slightly as the certainty that had carried her through the afternoon quietly disappeared. The taller deputy addressed her with the same professional tone he had used from the beginning. "Ma'am, this appears to be a civil matter involving Homeowners Association communications, not criminal trespassing. Mr. Carter has every legal right to access this property." She nodded mechanically, but kept glancing toward me as though expecting me to celebrate or lecture her. I did neither. There was nothing to gain from embarrassing someone who had already been confronted by the truth. My phone vibrated once more. Madison had sent a short message informing me that our legal department had already opened an internal review after hearing the details from dispatch. Every previous notice, every demand letter, every complaint submitted against my cabin during the past year would be examined alongside the association's correspondence. I quietly slipped the phone back into my pocket. The process would take care of itself. Frank Dawson slowly walked over from the boat ramp with the careful pace of someone carrying old memories. He extended his hand and smiled. "You look more like your father every year," he said. "I should have recognized you sooner." I smiled back and shook his hand. "It has been a while, Frank." His words seemed to ripple through the small crowd more effectively than any official document. Suddenly people began remembering things. One neighbor recalled seeing me helping repair the dock years earlier. Another remembered my parents hosting community fish fries before the Homeowners Association even existed. Faces that had looked uncertain only moments before softened with recognition. Victoria remained silent while those quiet conversations unfolded around her. She was no longer directing the story. She was simply listening to it change. As the deputies prepared to leave, the taller one turned back toward me. "Mr. Carter, if anyone attempts to prevent you from accessing your property again without legal authority, please contact the sheriff's office directly." I thanked him, and both patrol vehicles slowly pulled away, their flashing lights disappearing beyond the curve of the Lakeside road. The evening immediately became peaceful again. Crickets had begun their familiar chorus beneath the pines, and the last orange light of sunset shimmered across the calm water. I carried my canvas bag inside, placed the fresh bread on the old wooden kitchen counter, and started the coffee maker exactly as I had planned before the day took its unexpected turn. Through the front window, I noticed Victoria standing alone beside her vehicle for several quiet seconds before finally driving away without another word. The old brass key rested on the counter beside the coffee mug while the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee slowly filled the cabin. It struck me that the smallest object I carried all afternoon had quietly connected every piece of the story. That worn key had opened this same front door for decades. It had outlasted neighborhood politics, changing boards, and assumptions built on appearances. Some things never needed to announce their importance. They simply kept opening the right doors until everyone else finally understood why they had always fit the lock. Sunrise arrived the next morning with the soft glow that only a quiet lake seems capable of creating. Golden lights spilled across the dock, turning the gentle ripples into ribbons of copper, while a light mist drifted just above the water. I carried my coffee onto the porch, settled into the old wooden swing, and listened to the familiar chorus of birds waking in the tall pines. The same swing had greeted my grandfather before fishing trips. The same porch had welcomed my parents home after long work weeks. Nothing about the cabin had changed because of what happened the evening before. That realization mattered more than I expected. The place had never needed anyone else's approval to remain exactly what it had always been. Later that week, Madison called with an update. The company's attorneys had completed their initial review and sent formal letters requesting that all future communication regarding my properties follow the lease agreements and recorded ownership documents. They also reminded every tenant occupying company-owned residences that questions involving ownership or property rights must be directed through the management office rather than assumptions or informal neighborhood decisions. It was a routine legal step, handled professionally and without unnecessary drama. The Homeowners Association board also scheduled a meeting to review its internal procedures after several residents expressed concern about how quickly ordinary disagreements had escalated into official accusations. I did not attend. There was nothing left for me to prove. The records already spoke more clearly than I ever could. A few days later, Frank stopped by carrying a small tackle box that had belonged to my father. He had found it tucked away in his garage years earlier, and said he had been waiting for the right time to return it. We spent an hour sitting on the dock, talking about old fishing tournaments, neighborhood cookouts, and the days before every mailbox had matching paint. Those conversations reminded me that communities are built through trust, not control. Rules have their place, but respect has to come first. Before leaving, Frank looked toward the neighboring road and quietly smiled. Funny how people can live beside a place for years without ever really knowing its story. I nodded because I knew he was talking about much more than one cabin. As summer continued, neighbors gradually became friendlier. Some stopped to introduce themselves properly. Others shared stories about the early days of the lake that even I had never heard before. The old canoe still hung beneath the porch exactly where my grandfather had left it. The antique brass house numbers remained beside the front door. The dock furniture stayed exactly where my parents had always placed it. Nothing needed to be changed because nothing had ever been wrong with it. On my final evening before driving home, I locked the front door with the same worn brass key and paused for one last look across the calm water. That little key had quietly appeared from the beginning of this story until its very end. It had never opened opportunities for power. It had simply opened a family home. The difference was important. Property can be measured in acres, contracts, or market value. But a home is measured in memories, patience, and the people who protect it the right way. As I slipped the brass key back into my pocket, I realized the loudest voice on the lake had never decided how the story would end. The quiet truth had. Justice is never measured by who speaks first. It belongs to the person whose facts still stand after every opinion has faded away.